Ruth found a bruised, voiceless girl on her porch and offered her safety. But in doing so, she lost something she never thought she'd miss. What happened next changed their lives forever. She walked into sundown like a shadow spilled from the edge of the world. No wagon, no kin, no destination, just a threadbare shawl and a silence that felt heavier than steel. Her name was Ruth, though hardly anyone asked, and even fewer used it. The people whispered behind crooked doors and cracked windows, giving her other names: the Drifter's Bride, the Witch from Carrion Ridge. Some said she brought storms in her wake, that her footsteps left frost on the glass, that bad luck clung to her like smoke. They claimed her husband slit his own throat with a spoon just to escape the weight of her presence, but the truth was far colder. He drowned in a flood 3 winters ago. She had waited 3 days in a soaked cabin with a tin lamp and a squirrel boiled down to bone before finally burying the shirt he left behind. No funeral, no marker, just wet earth and memory. She left that place without looking back, not because she didn't love him, but because there was nothing left to hold on to. The next road was dirt and wind, and it led to Sundown. But Sundown wasn't a town built for strangers. It sat in a hollow between 2 ridges like a wound, and its people weren't raised on kindness, but on suspicion and superstition. Their eyes held a special kind of cruelty, the kind that waits for weakness and bites when you flinch. The church bell had just cracked in half the day. Ruth arrived, and the barkeep's dog had been found hanging from the water tower. Folks whispered that the land was cursed, and when they saw Ruth's quiet eyes and blood-dark mouth, they said she brought it with her. She didn't speak much, didn't smile at all, and when she prayed, it was only in her sleep. That was enough for them. The first week, a boy kicked slop water at her skirt. The second, a grocer shorted her change and slapped her when she dared to notice. By the third, someone had smeared dung on the chapel pew where she sat. No one said a word, not the preacher, not the people. They just looked away as if she were already halfway buried. She found shelter behind the blacksmith shop, a leaning shack eaten half by wind and rot. Days were long, nights were worse. She took what work she could, shucking potatoes in a kitchen that smelled like old meat, skinning squirrels for a trapper boy with crooked teeth, scrubbing the floor of a brothel where the women wore rouge that never smeared. Every job ended with bruises or every coin was handed out like charity and thrown like a curse. The real beatings didn't start with fists. They started with eyes, those cold, heavy stares that made her feel like something on a butcher's hook. Then came the bottles, the shoves, the rocks. She never fought back. Not yet. She folded herself small like paper, like something you burn. She moved through Sundown like a ghost pretending to still be flesh, and every time she thought it couldn't get worse, it did. She watched the preacher bless men who spat at her feet, watched mothers clutch their children as she walked by, like she was disease instead of woman. But she never ran, maybe because there was nowhere left to go, or maybe because the fire in her hadn't gone out. It had just gone quiet, waiting, and maybe the town knew that. Maybe that's why they feared her even as they beat her down. There was something about Ruth that couldn't be buried, no matter how deep they tried. And it wasn't just grief, it was something colder, something older, a kind of silence that watches, waits, and remembers. They saw a woman alone, and thought that meant weak. But Ruth wasn't weak, she was just gathering her pieces in the dark. Her eyes weren't empty, they were hiding, and every time they hurt her, every bruise, every spit, every cruel word, they didn't know they were shaping something dangerous, something sharp. Sundown wanted to break her, but all it did was teach her where the cracks were. People said she was cursed, but maybe they were looking at it all wrong. Maybe she wasn't the curse, maybe she was the warning, because people like Ruth don't die quietly, they rise, eventually, and when they do, they don't come back with kindness. They come with silence and scars and a story written in fire. She wasn't just a widow, she wasn't just a stranger, she was the kind of woman that history forgets until it can't. And one day, someone would remember her name, not as a witch, not as a ghost, but as the woman who walked into the town of Sundown and turned it inside out, not with guns, not yet, but with the kind of stillness that makes cruel men flinch, the kind that says, I've lost everything, and I'm still here, what else can you possibly take? The cattle auction smelled like sweat and dust, like hot iron and thick tension, the kind of place where men barked louder than their dogs and women were either invisible or owned. Ruth stood off to the side, silent, watching the pens like they were full of ghosts instead of cows. Her skirt was already dirt-stained, her fingers split from work, but she kept her chin up even when it ached. She didn't belong here, not in the way they measured worth. She had no land, no name they respected, and certainly no man beside her to pretend she mattered. So when she got too close to a cart, just a step too near, one of the men, broad and mean-eyed, shoved her into the dirt like she was nothing more than trash in his way. She didn't cry out, didn't scream, just sat there stunned, her lips split open, blood mixing with straw. Most folks turned their backs or laughed. A few jeered. One boy spit, but someone didn't laugh. Someone watched. He stood on the far rail, leaning lazy, a piece of licorice between his teeth, black hat pulled low over sharp eye. They called him the Black Ram, not just because he owned more livestock than anyone for 3 counties, but because he was known for a temper as brutal as wildfire. His name was Silas Root. Ruth had seen him before, from across the feed store porch, from the edge of the church lot, but he had never spoken to her, until now. He didn't rush, didn't shout. He stepped down from the railing and walked through the crowd like gravity bent differently around him. He stood between Ruth and the man who pushed her, Grayley, the butcher's cousin, and looked at Ruth first. Not with pity, not with shock, just with this strange steady calm. Then he looked at Grayley and said only 3 words, quiet as dusk. You done yet? Grayley puffed up, red-faced, all ego. She ain't your business. Rook spat out his licorice, then punched the man in the throat so fast and hard that Grayley dropped without a sound. The crowd gasped. The auctioneer went quiet. Even the cattle stopped bawling. Rook turned to Ruth again, offered a calloused hand. She didn't take it. She wasn't sure if she trusted it or him, so he crouched beside her instead, not with softness, but with the kind of steadiness that doesn't shake. He said, this ain't charity, ain't pity. I need a wife. I'm tired of looking. Say yes and you'll never be hit again. Ruth looked at him for a long time, her mouth bleeding, her heart somewhere between terror and stillness. She didn't know what this man was really offering. Maybe a deal, maybe a trap, but something in her shifted. Not trust, not hope, just the quiet realization that this might be the last door left open. So she nodded. One slow, deliberate nod. And that's how she became the wife of the richest man in the county, under a sky that looked like smoke, with no preacher, no music, no smiles, just a piece of paper, signed by the sheriff's assistant, and a ring slid onto her finger by hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. That night she rode with him back to the ranch, wind biting through her shawl, the hills wide and empty like some kind of warning. The house was huge, wood and stone, 2 stories tall, older than both of them put together. She stepped inside and did not weep, not even when she saw the stew left cold on the stove or the locked door at the end of the hall. She didn't ask about it. She knew what locked doors meant. They weren't always about hiding secrets. Sometimes they were about locking memories in. Silas didn't touch her that night. Didn't try. He gave her a blanket, showed her the guest room, and said only, there's matches in the drawer, house gets cold. And then he left her alone. She waited in the dark for footsteps. None came, just wind against the glass and the steady beat of her own heart. Days passed, then weeks. He never raised a hand, never raised his voice. He worked from dawn to dusk, wrangling cattle, repairing fences, coming home with mud on his boots and silence in his eyes. He didn't ask her to cook, didn't demand her body, didn't even sit close. He just gave her space, and his name, and in a place like Sundown, that was worth more than gold. Words spread fast. The girl everyone had spat at was now the Black Ram's wife. The beating stopped. The laughter dried up. Men who once smirked when she walked past now turned their eyes away. They didn't respect her, not exactly, but they feared what might happen if they touched her again, and that was good enough. Ruth began to clean the house, top to bottom. She scrubbed the floors with scalding water and pushed her presence into every room until her arms ached. It was the only control she had, that and her silence, which she still wore like armor. Every day she watched Silas, the way he limped slightly on his left side, the way he stared at the ridge too long when he thought no one was watching. He was a man with pain locked in his bones, and whatever fire once lived in him had cooled into something else, something quiet. She didn't ask what haunted him. He didn't ask why she flinched when the shutters banged in the wind. They lived like ghosts under the same roof, not touching, not speaking unless necessary, but in that silence, something grew, not love, not yet, but the possibility of something that wasn't fear. She learned the house, the creak in the stairs, the way sunlight hit the floorboards near the pantry. She found a ledger of cattle brands, older than the war, a box of hairpins under a loose board. Once, she saw him by a grave near the orchard. The headstone was worn blank. She hated lilacs, he said when he noticed her, said they smelled like corpses. Then he walked away. She didn't ask who, she didn't have to. That night she dreamed of a girl with ink on her fingers, and lilacs rotting on a pillow. Some things don't need to be said to be understood, and even though they never touched, not once, Ruth realized something strange. She wasn't afraid in that house, not like before. There were no footsteps behind the walls, no hands reaching for her in the dark, just wind, just silence, and a man who never asked her to smile. Was this safety, or just a different kind of prison, a quieter kind of cage? She didn't know, but for now, it was enough. Enough to sleep, enough to breathe, enough to wonder if maybe one day, she might start to trust again, not the man, not the house, but herself. Because somewhere deep down, buried beneath grief and scars, Ruth wasn't just surviving anymore. She was waiting for something more, for the silence to shift into something new. Silas didn't touch her, not even once. Not when she flinched if the floor creaked behind her. Not when she paused too long at locked doors. Not even when they sat in the same room for hours, with only silence between them. He barely spoke at all. Just simple words when needed. Waters boiled, wood stacked, storms coming. But what mattered most was what he didn't do. He didn't yell when she dropped a plate, didn't curse when supper burned. He didn't grab her wrist or her waist or any part of her body like it belonged to him. That in itself was something sacred, a silence that meant safety instead of punishment. And for Ruth, that was more than enough. When she coughed at night, he left water by her bedside. When her fingers split from scrubbing floors and churning butter, he brought gloves from town without her asking. He didn't explain, he didn't look for thanks. He just noticed, and she noticed too. The way his shoulders drooped more in the evenings, the way he stared too long at a wall that held no pictures. He was grieving, that much was clear, not loudly, not in tears, but in how he moved like someone carrying a weight he'd long forgotten how to put down. Ruth didn't ask what or who it was. She didn't need to. Grief recognized grief, even in silence. She'd spent enough nights crying into the sleeve of a borrowed coat to know the shape of it, and so, she cleaned, she scrubbed the floors until her knuckles bled, polished the windows until her reflection scared her. She cleaned like she was trying to erase the past, like maybe if she scrubbed hard enough, the ghosts in her chest would scatter. The house had been quiet before her, but now it was starting to breathe. She left her mark in the corners, in the scent of soap and ash, in the rhythm of her boots against the floorboards. It was the only thing she could control. Her voice, her body, even her history, felt like things long ago stolen. But the act of making something clean, of making it hers, that was power, and Silas never stopped her, never questioned why she worked herself raw. Instead, He gave her a name that forced the town to reconsider her existence. When people spat at her before, they did it without thinking, but now when they saw her, they looked away, not out of respect, but fear, because the Black Ram's wife was no longer just some broken woman from the hills. She belonged to someone they feared, and in a town like Sundown, that was enough to buy silence. At the feed store, men stepped aside. At the chapel, no one dared block her pew. She could feel the shift, not welcome but warning, and that was fine. She wasn't there to be liked, she was there to survive. Still, even survival wears thin if it's all you know. So when Scylla started sitting on the porch in the evenings, whittling wood with slow, deliberate hands, Ruth found herself standing in the doorway longer and longer before finally stepping outside. He never invited her, never motioned, just left an empty chair beside his own, and a tin cup of whiskey that tasted faintly of sugar and smoke. At first she didn't drink it, then one night she did, and they sat that way side by side, not speaking, not even looking at each other, just exist, like two trees growing side by side, different roots, same wind. Some nights they watched the stars, some nights they watched the dust roll across the hills like a ghost returning home. The silence between them didn't feel cold, it stretched safe, steady, like something built to hold weight. Slowly, like rain carving stone, they began to understand each other in glances, a nod, a look, a pause that meant more than words ever could. Ruth began to learn the house, not just its layout, but its memory. The way the floor near the kitchen sagged slightly, the way the light hit the pantry door like a whisper. She found a small room behind the pantry with a broken rocking chair and a ledger of cattle brands dating back to wars long forgotten. She found a tin box under the floor, with old hairpins, and a child's glove too small for anyone living. She didn't ask, she didn't have to. Some things were too heavy to hold out loud. Once she caught Scylla standing over a grave near the orchard. The stone was blank, worn smooth by wind and time. He didn't notice her at first. When he did, he just muttered, "She hated lilacs," said they stank like corpses, then turned and walked away. That night, Ruth dreamed of a girl with ink-stained fingers and empty eyes, lilacs blooming like rot across her pillow. She woke with a start, but didn't speak of it. Instead, she folded the memory into herself like so many others. When summer came, she started riding the land with Silas, not because he asked, because she wanted to know what he saw when he looked at the horizon. The first time, he told her to stay back, said the land was rough, the ride too long. She didn't answer, just climbed onto the mule and waited. He didn't argue again. From that point forward, she rode beside him. She watched him mend fences, birth calves, bury a dog bitten by a rattlesnake. She didn't cry when the dog died, but later, she saw him cry, just a single tear, quickly wiped when he thought she wasn't looking. That was when something inside her shifted again, a thread between them, not yet knotted, but real. They started talking barely, a sentence here, a thought there. He'd mutter, "Too dry this year," and she'd nod, "Won't last." Then one day, she asked him to teach her to shoot. He hesitated, then went to the cellar, pulled out a Winchester, and handed it to her like it was a newborn. "It'll knock you off your feet the first time," he said. "That's how you know it's real." He was right. The kick sent her into the dust, breath stolen, and then, she laughed, a short startled sound like a bird escaping its cage. He didn't laugh, but he smiled, almost, helped her up, loaded another round, and day by day, she got better. By autumn, she could hit a squirrel from 50 yards, could gut it without flinching. He never praised her, she never asked. What grew between them wasn't romance, not the kind with flowers and soft words. It was something slower, something earned. Trust wasn't given, it was built in silence, and shared chores, in the way she salted meat while he repaired saddles, in how she remembered the names of far pastures, and how storms curled like smoke on the canyon rim. At night, they still slept in separate beds, or sometimes just opposite sides of the same one, but there was no fear, not anymore. And for Ruth, that meant more than love ever could, because she'd known love that turned to bruises. She'd known promises that curdled into pain. But this This quiet, steady presence beside her. This was new. This was real. This was safe. And sometimes, when she watched him from across the table, or the porch or the barnyard, she wondered, what do you call love that doesn't look like love at all? That doesn't come with kisses, or poems, or tears. Maybe it wasn't love, not yet. Maybe it was the beginning of something else, something better. Because in a world that had tried to bury her, beat her, burn her, what Ruth had now wasn't just a man or a house, or even peace. What she had was space. Space to heal, space to breathe, space to become something more than just what had happened to her. And maybe, just maybe, that was what real love looked like. Not hearts, not flowers, but a chair beside someone who lets you be exactly who you are, and never once asks you to explain why. Time passed like wind over stone, slow, constant, carving things down until they were something new. Ruth and Silas began to move like two parts of the same machine, riding the land together, side by side, without needing words to fill the silence. The dust didn't bother her anymore. The hard work didn't either. Morning started before the sun rose, the two of them saddling up without a word spoken, riding out to check fences, herd cattle, watch for wolves. She learned the lay of the land, the shallow dips in the ridge, the slick paths where hooves slipped after rain, the way storms curled around the far hills like smoke with teeth. Silas taught her things without calling it teaching. How to follow hoofprints when the grass had been trampled by wind, how to tell when a cow's about to birth, how to feel the shift in the air before lightning strikes. And Ruth picked it up fast. She didn't talk much, didn't smile much, but she listened, she watched, and soon, she knew that land like it had been stitched into her skin. She could shoot straight now, clean and fast. She could gut a rabbit in minutes, patch a broken stirrup, and aim her rifle with the kind of steady calm most men couldn't manage. But beneath all that strength, beneath the quiet routine and long rides and quiet dinners, the ghosts still lingered. There was still the grave near the orchard, its stone worn down until it looked like bone. There was still the glove beneath the floorboards, too small for Ruth's hand, too heavy for her heart. And Silas never spoke of the past. But sometimes Ruth would find him staring into the distance like he saw something coming, or maybe something returning. Then one evening, the silence broke. A letter came, nailed to the barn door, the name written in thick, slanted ink, Jebediah Crane. Silas read it, then sat down on the porch like his bones had turned to sand. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was soft. He's not a man, he's a plague in boots. Ruth waited. Let him talk. We used to ride together, he said, before the ranch, before you. We stole cattle, burned fields. I left that life, but I never paid what I owed. Ruth didn't blink. What does he want? She asked. Me, or blood? Maybe both. Silas looked at her then, truly looked, and asked in a voice stripped of pride, are you scared? She didn't answer with words. She turned, walked into the house, pulled the rifle from behind the door, and loaded it slow. He won't have me, she said. That night, they didn't sleep much. They prepared instead, fortified the barn, dug trenches near the fence line, placed oil tins along the road like tiny traps. Ruth started sleeping in her boots. Silas kept a pistol by the bed, and every time the wind changed, they looked to the ridge, waiting. 3 nights later the riders came, 5 of them, dusty, armed, with Crane at the front, tall, leathery, with a grin that looked carved into his face. They didn't attack, not that night, just circled the ranch, their shadows stretching across the house like a curse. Then they rode off without a word, a warning. The next morning, Ruth found a dead cow near the creek, its tongue cut out, eyes wide in terror. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she just buried it herself. That evening, she sat on the porch with the rifle across her lap, Silas beside her. They didn't speak until the sun dipped below the hills. Then he said, you can run, take the mule, head east, find a town where no one knows your name. She stared ahead. You think I married you to escape? I think you married me because it was the only door left open. She turned to him then, calm and sharp. Then you should know, I don't walk through doors just to run back out. Crane returned on the fourth night. No more warnings. A bullet shattered the kitchen window. Another struck the fence post where Ruth had stood seconds before. She fired back from the porch, dropped one of their horses. The air turned to chaos. Gunshots, smoke, hoofbeats. Celis took a bullet to the shoulder but kept firing, his face pale but steady. Ruth aimed and shot again, catching Crane's coat and tearing a hole clean through. Then silence. When the dust cleared, the riders were gone, but they'd left something behind. Blood on the gravel, not enough for death, but enough for a trail. Celis collapsed not long after. Fever hit fast. Infection bloomed. Ruth boiled rags, changed bandages, whispered nothing, just worked, just waited, just watched the ridge for another shadow. On the third day, she packed food, the rifle and Celis's knife. He was too weak to stop her. You don't know what he is, he whispered. She leaned close. I know what he's not. He's not the last man to think he owned me. Then she rode out, alone, toward the canyon, toward old debts that weren't even hers. They said the canyon had no name, just a wound in the earth, where men went to disappear. Vultures circled above it like a warning, but Ruth didn't. She followed the trail like it was scripture. Broken branches, hoofprints, blood dried to rust. When her mule stumbled and threw a shoe, she walked. When her boots tore apart, she kept going barefoot. Her shoulder bled, her hands cracked. She didn't stop, didn't sleep, didn't pray. Crane's camp sat low in a basin, choked with mesquite. Smoke curled from a fire. Horses drank by the edge. She waited until nightfall, crouched low, breath slow and steady. Then she moved, quiet, precise. She slit the throat of the first man, dragged his body into the brush. The second she shot, in the belly, he screamed, and chaos erupted. Gunfire, shouting, but Crane didn't run. He stood by the fire like he'd been expecting her. You're not as pretty as they said, he called out. Ruth stepped from the dark. They laughed. His grin was black, rotten, full of violence. You think this is vengeance, he said. You don't know the first thing about it. I know enough, she said. Then they both fired. His bullet grazed her arm, hers. They circled each other like wolves, the fire hissing between them. You're his woman now, Crane spat, his shield. That what you are? I'm not anyone's anything, she said. Then she lunged. The knife caught his wrist. He caught hers. They fell, rolling through dust and blood. He hit her, hard. She bit his hand until the bone cracked. He screamed. She jammed the knife under his ribs, pulled. He froze, shuddered, collapsed. She didn't cry, just stood, shaking, and put a bullet in the last rider's head. Then she burned the camp tents, maps, saddles, until the canyon lit gold and black. When the flames died, she turned south. Fever nipped at her heels. Her shoulder oozed, her vision blurred. She drank from muddy puddles, slept under thorn trees. When she finally crested the ridge and saw the ranch below, her knees buckled. She collapsed in the yard, dirt in her mouth, hands clenched like fists. Celis found her there, half dead, carried her inside, sat beside her for 3 days. When she woke, he said only, "You're home." She nodded. It's done. And it was. She had survived before. But this was different. She hadn't just endured. She had chosen to fight, to face, to end something that should have ended long ago. Because she wasn't just someone's wife anymore. She wasn't just a woman with scars. She was something else now. Something sharp, something sacred, something earned. She was a woman who had walked into hell and made it burn behind her. And maybe that's what survival really is. Not just staying alive, but turning your survival into purpose, into fire, into a name the world would never forget. They came when the night was deepest, when the moon hung low and the land was as still as breath before a scream. 5 of them, riders wrapped in shadow, their eyes hollow with hate, and at their front, Jebediah Crane, coat heavy with old sins, his mouth curved in that same grin that seemed carved from bone and spite. Ruth had been sitting on the porch, rifle across her lap, watching the darkness, waiting. The first shot came without warning. It shattered the kitchen window, splintered wood and glass, sent the oil lamp crashing to the floor. Another bullet slammed into the fence post, where she had stood just moments before. But Ruth didn't freeze, didn't panic. She moved fast, like muscle remembered before, thought caught up. She dropped to one knee, took aim, fired, and one of the horses went down screaming. The others scattered briefly, dust flying. Silas emerged from the doorway, face pale, gun in hand. He returned fire, holding the line as if the wood beneath their feet was sacred. Another bullet found him, high in the shoulder, spinning him back against the doorframe. He didn't fall right away. He gritted his teeth, fired until the hammer clicked dry. Ruth dragged him inside as the riders vanished into the dark, leaving only smoke and silence behind. Silas slumped against the wall, sweat already beading, his skin turning gray around the edges. Fever came fast, wrapping itself around his bones like ice beneath the skin. Ruth cleaned the wound, boiled water, whispered nothing. She didn't cry, she didn't ask if he would make it. She just moved, just did what needed doing, because grief could wait, but revenge could not. By the third day, his fever spiked so high, his lips cracked. He muttered names she didn't know. He reached for things that weren't there, and when he finally slept, too weak to speak, Ruth packed what she needed: jerked meat, a canteen, a coil of rope, Silas's knife, and slung her rifle over her shoulder. No goodbye, just one last look at the man who had given her space to breathe, then the sound of the door closing behind her. Trail wasn't hard to follow. They wanted her to find them. Bent branches, hoofprints sunk deep in dry clay, blood spatters like breadcrumbs, left for vengeance. She rode hard, eyes narrowed, hair tied back so tight it pulled at her scalp. The pain helped her focus, reminded her of the body she still lived in. She didn't stop for sleep, didn't eat unless her hands started to shake. The mule gave out on the second night, threw a shoe and buckled. She left it behind, walked the last miles through dust and thorn, her boots splitting, her feet blistering raw. When she reached the canyon, the sky was a deep red, like it had been bruised. No name marked this place on a map, just a gash in the earth, dry and jagged, where things went to die, or be forgotten. Vultures circled above, slow and patient. She moved like shadow, low to the ground, breath shallow. Crane's camp was nestled in a basin thick with mesquite. Smoke drifted from a fire, horses tethered near water. 5 men, maybe 4 now, moved in and out of the flickering light. One stood apart, tall, wrapped in skins, his face turned toward the wind like he was listening for something only he could hear. She waited until night fully took the sky, until the fire was the only light left. Then she moved. First came the one on watch. He never saw her. The knife slid through his throat clean. She caught his body before it hit the dirt, dragged it into the brush, covered it with dry leaves. The second was at the latrine. She shot him in the gut. He screamed. She shot again. Silence cracked. Then chaos, shouting, gunfire, men stumbling awake half-dressed, grabbing rifles. But she wasn't after them, not yet. She was after the one at the fire, Crane, and he was still there, standing, smiling, like he'd known she'd come. "You're not as pretty as they said," he called. His voice was a knife. Ruth stepped into the light. "They lied." He laughed, dry and jagged. "You think this is vengeance? You don't know the first thing about it." "I know enough," she said. He moved first, drew his gun, fired. The bullet tore through her upper arm. Blood soaked her sleeve. She didn't fall. She fired back, missed. The fire hissed, sparks danced. They circled each other, slow, deliberate. "You're his woman now," Crane spat, his little shield. "I'm not anyone's anything," she said, and then she lunged. The knife caught his wrist. He howled, caught hers. They fell hard and tangled, rolling through ash and dust. He struck her face once, twice. Her vision blurred, her ears rang. She bit down on his thumb, until she felt bone crack. He screamed again. She jammed the blade under his ribs, and pulled. The sound he made was not human. He froze, hands grasping at air, then slumped to the ground like a bag of wet stone. She crawled away, bleeding, gasping, stared at the stars until they stopped spinning. It wasn't over. One man remained. He was trying to flee with the horses. She stood, raised the rifle, aimed through shaking hands, shot him through the leg, then the head. Silence returned, not peaceful, hollow, final. She burned the camp, every tent, every saddle, every map. The fire reached high, painted the canyon walls gold and black. She watched it all burn, blood crusting on her skin, smoke in her hair. No prayers, no mercy. When it was done, she gathered what she could: water, a revolver, a few bandages, and turned south. The ride back blurred into fragments. Her shoulder burned with fever. She drank from puddles when the canteen ran dry, slept beneath trees with thorns sharp enough to pierce dreams. Twice she fainted. Once she woke with a vulture perched nearby, just watching, but she kept moving, because something in her refused to stop. By the time she reached the ridge, her legs gave out. She fell in the yard, dirt in her mouth, blood on her chest. Celis found her that way, carried her inside, cleaned her wounds with rainwater and whispered her name over and over, like it was the only word left in the world. She burned for 3 days, shivered under blankets, fought the pain like it was a second war. On the 4th day she opened her eyes. "You're home," he said. She stared out the window, eyes glassy. "It's done." He nodded. "I know, I killed them. I know," he said again. She turned her face toward the light. Outside, the orchard was blooming. Bees hummed. Wind drifted through the grass. That night, they lay in the same bed, not as strangers, not as saviors, just two people who had walked through hell and come back with ash in their lungs, and something steadier in their hearts. And when the morning came, she rose, walked to the creek, and scrubbed the blood from her clothes, hung them to dry on the lawn, sat on the porch with the rifle beside her, and watched the road. No one came, no more letters, no more curses, just silence, but not the kind that haunted, the kind that was earned, the kind that said, "I faced death, I faced men who thought I could be broken, and I came back whole," or at least something stronger than whole. Because when you've burned everything behind you, when your fear dies in the fire, what's left isn't just survival, it's something sharper, something that doesn't flinch, something the world doesn't have a name for. What do you become when there's nothing left to fear? You become what they never saw coming. You become free. Ruth came back to the ranch with blood on her shirt, smoke in her hair, and fire still clinging to her breath. She didn't ride in with her head high like a hero. She stumbled, knees buckling, body too torn and fevered to stand. She collapsed right there in the dirt yard, where cattle once grazed, face down, her hand still clutching the rifle like a lifeline. Her boots were ruined, her feet blistered and raw. Her shoulder oozed through bandages long soaked through, but she had made it. She had come back. Celis found her like that, barely breathing, half dead, half wild, and without a word, he lifted her into his arms, carried her inside like something sacred and fragile. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand stories. He boiled rainwater, cleaned her wounds, stitched her skin with hands that shook, only slightly, and then he sat, day after day, beside her bed, not speaking, just watching, waiting, as if keeping her tethered to the world, with nothing more than his presence. On the 4th day her eyes opened, cracked lips, sunken cheeks, fever still whispering behind her eyes. "It's done," she said, barely more than breath. He nodded once. "I know." That was all. No grand speeches, no talk of heroes, just quiet understanding, between two people who had already said more in silence than most did in words. After that, they never spoke of Crane, not his name, not the fire, not the men buried in the canyon dust. It didn't need saying. What was done was. Ruth got better slow, bone by bone, step by step, and when she was strong enough to stand, she walked to the creek, washed the blood from her clothes, and hung them on the line like a flag that no one dared salute. Life didn't return to normal, because there was no normal to return to. There was only what came next. The orchard bloomed, and bees drifted lazily through the air like they owned the place. The cattle that had survived the winter wandered near the fence line. The ranch felt quieter now, not in that haunted way, but in the way something feels after a storm passes. Wrecked. Yes, but clear. Ruth took to her routines again, but they felt different, heavier, maybe, or just more real. She rode the far pastures before sunrise, checked fences, salted meat, patched roofs. Her shoulder still ached where Crane's bullet had kissed the bone, a scar now, a reminder. She never complained, just worked through it, Pain, after all, was nothing new. It was just another thing to carry. Silas walked with a limp now, slower than before. His strength didn't come as quick, and some days the ache in his side bent him double. But he never said a word. He buried his pistol beneath the cottonwood tree behind the barn, said it was time to live with different tools. Ruth kept hers oiled and clean, and resting just by the door, not out of fear, out of memory. A memory that could still knock on the door without warning. But the town didn't come knocking. Word had spread, whispered across feed stores and back porches, about what happened to Crane, about the fire in the canyon. No one said Ruth's name, but everyone knew it. They stopped spitting when she walked past. They stopped jeering. At the post office, people looked down. At the church they stepped aside. It wasn't respect. Not exactly. It was caution, like something too sharp to hold without gloves, and that suited her just fine. She didn't want their friendship, just their silence, and she had earned it. Seasons rolled over the land like old stories. Crops died early, dust turned the hills into ash, the cattle thin. But Ruth and Silas endured. They patched, mended, stitched life together, one fence post at a time. He still worked the fields, but now she paid the ranch hands. She made the trades, bartered for feed. She became the voice when it was needed. He didn't mind. There was no ego between them, just survival turned partnership. Sometimes, at night they sat on the porch again, the same tin cup between them, the same silence, but it had changed, no longer empty. Now it held something warm, something solid. They never said I love you, never needed to. Their love wasn't built on words, it was built on blood, on bruises, on mornings where one poured coffee for the other, without asking. It lived in the quiet, in the scarred knuckles and shared tools, in the way he passed her gloves before she even reached for them. Ruth still dreamed some nights, of Crane, of fire, of a girl with ink on her fingers, and lilacs rotting in the dark. But the dreams didn't paralyze her anymore. She woke, stretched, got on with it, because fear no longer ruled her, not after everything. And maybe that was what peace really was. Not comfort, not safety, but the ability to keep moving, even with the scars still burning. One morning, a letter arrived at the ranch. No name, just a wax seal and folded parchment. Ruth read it, then burned it. Silas didn't ask. She didn't offer. Some things belonged to the fire. They planted beans that year near the orchard. Small rows at first. The soil was dry, the sun too cruel, but Ruth watered them anyway. Watched the sprouts push through the dirt like something determined to live. Watched them stretch toward the sky like they were hungry for it. She knew that feeling, knew it deep. And when she looked at the tiny green shoots, she wondered, can peace grow in the same soil where violence once bloomed? She didn't have an answer, but she kept tending those beans, just the same, because something in her believed it was possible, even if just a little, even if just enough. It was spring when the girl came, though the air still carried a bite from winter. She arrived on foot, clothes torn, bruises blooming like ink down her arms, a silence so deep, it seemed stitched into his skin. She didn't knock, just stood there, wide-eyed and barefoot, staring at the house like it might vanish if she blinked. Ruth opened the door and looked at her, really looked, and said nothing, just stepped aside. There were no questions, no demands. Ruth didn't ask who the girl was running from, or how far she'd come, or why her lips trembled when she drank warm broth. She simply made a cot by the stove, laid a wet cloth against the girl's swollen cheek, and kept the fire going. The girl didn't speak, not the next day, not the next week, but she watched, followed Ruth around the ranch like a shadow, watched how she cleaned the rifle, watched how she salted meat, tended the beans, sharpened the knife without blinking. Ruth didn't speak much either. She didn't need to. Everything she knew was already written into her hands, into the rhythm of her work, into the land that obeyed her like it had learned to trust her. One evening, as the wind stirred dust across the porch, the girl picked up a knife, held it awkwardly, as if waiting for permission. Ruth nodded, quiet and sure, then knelt beside her and showed her how to hold it without fear, how to carve, how to gut, how to survive, And the girl learned quick. Maybe too quick. Like survival was something she already knew but had just forgotten how to shape. The silence between them became a language. They shared it like bread. Not empty, but understood. When summer came, they rode fence lines together. Ruth still wore her boots with the worn-out soles. Still kept the rifle near. The girl rode beside her now, her shoulders stronger, her hands sure. She named the cattle, knew the smell of storms before they hit. Once, she asked Ruth if the ranch had a name. Ruth thought for a while, then said, "It's not a name that keeps a place alive. It's what it remembers." The girl didn't ask what that meant. She didn't need to. The orchard bloomed again that fall, and now there were 2 gravestones beneath its trees. No names, just worn carvings and soft dirt. Memories held in stone and soil. Ruth never spoke of who they were for. The girl never asked. That was the thing about scars, you didn't need to point at them to know they were there. Time passed. Like slow rain, the girl became a woman. Her silence remained. But it had changed shape. It no longer felt like fear. It felt like choice. Like power. She rode the southern pasture alone by 16, branded her first calf at 18, knew how to load, aim and fire with steady hands. Ruth grew older. Her hair silvered. Her joints stiffened. But her eyes lost none of their edge. When strangers rode up the road now, they didn't see a broken widow. They saw 2 women on the porch. One older, one young, one with a rifle, the other with eyes that didn't flinch, and that was enough. Strangers didn't linger. Folks in town didn't whisper anymore. They remembered what happened to Crane, what happened to the preacher who let hate take root. The stories had grown twisted, like stories always do, but the ending remained the same. Don't mess with the ranch past Carrion Ridge, not unless you want to meet the girl who never spoke, and the woman who burned a canyon to the ground. Ruth never remarried, never softened. She didn't need love in the way people usually meant it. She had loyalty, she had peace, earned, and protected, and she had the girl now grown, whose silence mirrored her own. They built things together, a new well, a stronger fence line, a life stitched out of grit and ash. No one told them how to do it. No one could. One night Ruth found the girl at the kitchen table, lighting and snuffing a match again and again, her hands shaking just a little. Ruth sat down, waited. After a long time, the girl said, "They buried my mama," with her eyes open. Ruth didn't flinch, just said, "You want me to dig her out?" The girl blinked, shook her head. "She ain't in the ground no more." That was the only time she ever spoke about her past. The next morning, she started calling the cattle by name again. The orchard kept blooming. The house stood tall, weathered but firm. Ruth tended it like a captain tending a ship long past war. She still rose early, still cleaned her rifle, still checked the path from the ridge before making coffee. Peace didn't mean she let her guard down. It meant she knew what it took to keep. And peace like this, the kind built on scars, on blood, on silence. It wasn't fragile, it was bone deep, rooted, the kind of peace no one could take, not anymore. And when people talked about her, and they didn't talk about the witch from Carrion Ridge. They talked about the woman who made the butcher's boy disappear, about the girl who came with bruises, and stayed to become legend. They didn't say their names, but they remembered what happened to anyone who came up that road with bad intentions. Not every story ends in fire. Some end in scars, in 2 women who refused to be broken, who carved their safety into the land itself, who looked at a world that tried to ruin them and said, "Not here, not anymore."